In this lecture, we are going to talk about writing trig equations from graphs. So let's take a look at this first one. The first thing I'm going to look at is the scales that we have on the x and y axis. On the x-axis, we go from 0 to pi, and on the y-axis, we go 0 and 2. Now I'm going to label some numbers I may not see here. So I'm going to put a 1 here. This is going to be 0.5. This is 1.5, and this is going to be 2.5. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to find the vertical shift. In other words, we're going to find the midline. Now, to find the vertical shift, I'm going to find the center of my graph, right where it cuts it in half. So if you notice, here's the height right here, and then here's a valley, and they all meet at 2. That means my graph had to have shifted up 2. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that my graph is shifted up 2, so I'm just going to shift it back down, just so I can kind of see what I'm working with here. So instead of 2.5, I'm going to go to 0.5. Instead of 1.5, I'm going to go down to negative 0.5. Instead of 2.5 here, I'm going to go down to 0.5. And then instead of 1.5, I'm going to go down to negative 0.5. So this is going to be somewhat what my new graph looks like without that vertical shift. So now I recognize that I am working with a cosine graph. And I know I'm working with a cosine graph because of what happens right here. I start at the peak and I go down. So that's going to tell me it's cosine. And I'm going to put cosine x. Now, because it's cosine x, I remember that I'm supposed to be at a 1 where cosine is. So instead of 1, I'm at 0.5, which means I cut that in half. So my amplitude is going to be 1/2. Because instead of at 1, I'm at 0.5. Now the last thing I need to figure out is what my frequency is going to be. Now what I see here is I see one period between 0 and a little bit after half. But I'm going to keep on going, and if you notice, between 0 and pi, I make one full wave plus half of another. So what I have here is I have 1.5 periods. Now how many periods are going to be in 2 pi? So if I double 1.5, that's going to get me 3. So my frequency is going to be 3 when I have 2 pi. So now I need to put this all together. So my equation is going to be y equals the amplitude times cosine, and then my frequency is 3x, and then my midline is going to be plus 2. Let's take a look at my second graph. The first thing I want to do is understand what my x and y axes are saying. So here I see my x-axis goes from 0 to 4 pi, and I'm counting by half pi every time. And then my y-axis has a 0, negative 2, and 2. Well, I'm going to go ahead and label some missing numbers here. I know that's negative 1, and so that's going to be 1. So the first thing I want to do is I want to find my vertical shift. So I'm going to look to see where my graph gets cut in half. And my graph gets cut in half at negative 1. So my equation shifted down 1. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to visualize where my original graph was. So if it shifted down 1, I'm going to move everything up by 1. So -1 goes to 0. And here at pi, instead of 1, I'm at 2. At 2 pi, instead of -1, I'm at 0. At 3 pi, instead of being at -3, I'm going to be at -2. And then at 4 pi, instead of at -1, I'm going to be at 0. So that's my graph before I shift. So I'm just going to kind of sketch it out here just so I can kind of see what's going on. Now I know that this is going to be a sine graph. And I know this because without that vertical shift, it starts at 0. Now let's talk about the period. If I start at 0 and I go to 2 pi, remember the period is going to be how long it takes for one segment. Well, that's going to be 4 pi. So my period is 4 pi. And that's going to help me figure out what my frequency is. Remember, my frequency is how much does this occur in 2 pi. So if you look at the graph, 2 pi is halfway. So even though my period is 4 pi, my frequency is going to be half of that, so 1/2. Now, let's write the equation. I'm going to have y equals, and now I just realized I forgot to talk about the amplitude. So let's talk about the amplitude here. When we talk about sine, my highest point is supposed to be at 1. Now how do I get to 2? I'm going to multiply the equation by 2. And that's going to stretch it out for me. So my amplitude is going to be 2, which means my equation is going to be y equals 2 sine of x. Now to put my frequency in there, I need to put 1/2 x, and then I'm going to put the vertical shift, which is -1. And that is the equation for this graph.